On the evening of August 28, 2024, in the affluent Long Island hamlet of St. James, New York, two people who had finally found happiness after years of hardship were about to have their second chance violently stolen. Kelly Coppola, 50 years old, and Kenneth Pullman Jr., 53, had built something precious, a blended family emerging from the ashes of loss and pain. But 3 miles away, Kelly's ex-husband was preparing to execute a plan he had been refining for months. What unfolded that night would expose the darkest consequences of post-divorce rage, the vulnerability of domestic violence survivors even after legal separation, and the devastating ripple effects when obsession transforms into premeditated murder. This is a chilling true story of love, interrupted a real crime documentary, exploring how jealousy, resentment, and perceived financial ruin drove one man to commit an act so calculated that investigators would find bullets literally labeled with the names of his intended victims. Before we go deeper into this dark history, subscribe if you love investigative documentaries that examine the psychology behind true crime, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. To understand how this tragedy unfolded, we need to return to the beginning, to Kelly Jean Coppola's early life, when the future seemed bright, and the woman her family would later mourn was just a girl growing up on Long Island, with dreams that didn't include becoming a victim. Kelly was born in 1974 to John and Karen Patton, entering a world where family connections mattered deeply and loyalty ran through generations. Her childhood home was filled with the ordinary chaos of siblings, two brothers, Ryan and Kyle, alongside stepbrother Keith and stepsister Courtney from her parents' blended family arrangements. From her earliest years, those who knew Kelly described her as what they called the ultimate daddy's girl, a phrase that captured not just affection, but the deep bond she shared with her father, John. Her sister-in-law, Lori Patton, who would know Kelly for 27 years after meeting Kelly's brother Ryan in high school, remembered that Kelly maintained an almost ritualistic closeness with her parents. She called her mother every single day, without fail. She was the apple of her father's eye, Lori would later recall, a devotion that would make Kelly's eventual murder even more devastating for the Patton family to process. Kelly attended Sachem High School alongside her brothers, moving through the social landscape of suburban Long Island in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Lori, who had an insider's perspective on Kelly's personality from those formative years through adulthood, consistently described her as beautiful and fun. Not in the superficial way those words sometimes carry, but in the deeper sense of someone who genuinely radiated warmth. Kelly had accumulated so many friends over the years that maintaining those relationships became a defining characteristic. She kept in contact with everyone, never forgot a birthday, never missed reaching out to people she cared about. There was this light inside of her, Lori explained, a quality that made Kelly what she called a bubbly human being who always spread joy. The image of Kelly that emerges from these accounts is someone perpetually smiling, someone whose presence brightened rooms, the kind of person whose absence would leave a permanent void. Her extended family remembered Kelly as someone who showed up. She never missed a soccer game when her nieces and nephews played. She attended school events, recitals, competitions. Later, her nieces and nephews would call her the best auntie ever, a title earned through consistent presence rather than grand gestures. This pattern of showing up, of being dependable, of putting family first, it would continue throughout Kelly's life, even as that life became increasingly complicated and dangerous. After high school, Kelly's trajectory followed what many would consider a traditional path for young women of her generation and social background. She met Daniel Coppola, and the two eventually married. The details of their courtship aren't preserved in the public record, but what we know is that together, they welcomed a daughter, Gianna, who would become what everyone described as the absolute center of Kelly's universe. For a time, from the outside, things appeared normal. Whatever normal means in the complex landscape of modern marriage, Kelly worked in accounting at a media company, a detail that suggests she had professional skills and ambitions beyond domestic life. She was balancing career demands with motherhood, a juggling act familiar to millions of working mothers. Her devotion to Gianna manifested in the specific ways mothers demonstrate love, attending every cheerleading competition, every school event, structuring her schedule around her daughter's activities. Laurie remembered that a lot of their world revolved around cheer competitions, and Kelly took the time to always be there. Her goal was making sure Gianna was provided for, and also doing things for Gianna, taking her on vacations, trips into New York City, visits to Great Adventure Amusement Park, pilgrimages to Disney World. She wanted to make Gianna as happy as possible, Laurie explained, a maternal drive that would become even more poignant in light of what Gianna would eventually witness. But behind this facade of normal family life, Kelly was struggling with something those closest to her could sense, but that she rarely discussed openly. Kelly was by nature a private person when it came to her marital problems. She didn't broadcast her difficulties or seek sympathy through public complaint. Yet the signs were there for those who knew where to look. Her family would later describe Daniel as abusive, though the specifics of that abuse remain partly shielded by Kelly's privacy and the limitations of what became public record. Police records would later show there had been one documented domestic incident during their marriage, though significantly, it was labeled non-criminal, a classification that domestic violence experts often point to as problematic, since many abusive situations don't result in criminal charges, despite causing real harm and fear. For Kelly's family, especially Laurie and the Patton clan, the reality was darker than what appeared on paper or in police reports. They knew things about Kelly's marriage that wouldn't emerge until after her death, when the need to explain her vulnerability to Daniel's rage became urgent. The distinction between what police reports capture and what victims experience is a recurring theme in domestic violence cases, one that would become central to understanding how Kelly ended up murdered despite having legally separated from her abuser. Eventually, Kelly made what those around her described as a brave decision. She chose to leave. The divorce proceedings were, by all accounts, documented, contentious, and difficult. Detective Lieutenant Kevin Behrer would later tell reporters covering the case that apparently the divorce was final, and apparently it was a contentious divorce, a statement that, while confirming the conflict, also reveals how even law enforcement sometimes lacks full visibility into the emotional warfare that accompanies high-conflict separations. What Kelly didn't know at the time, what she couldn't have fully grasped even as she navigated divorce attorneys and custody arrangements, was the depth of Daniel's blame. He held her entirely responsible for what he perceived as his financial ruin. The bitterness wasn't just present, it was festering beneath the surface, growing more dangerous with each court appearance, each financial disclosure, each moment. Daniel felt his life spiraling beyond his control. The divorce was finalized sometime in 2022 or 2023. Sources differ on the exact date, but what's clear is that only 1 or 2 years separated Kelly's legal freedom from her murder. For Kelly, the divorce represented freedom from a marriage that had caused her pain. She could finally focus on being the mother Gianna deserved, and perhaps, she hoped, one day finding happiness again. She remained close to her family throughout this difficult period, leaning on those childhood connections that had always sustained her. As Kelly emerged from her divorce in 2023, she was finally ready to embrace life again. She was working, raising Gianna, staying connected to her family and friends, rebuilding in the way survivors do after escaping destructive relationships. What Kelly did not know was that her fresh start was about to lead her to someone who would change everything, someone whose own story of loss and resilience would mirror her own in ways that seemed almost fated. Kenneth Pullman Jr., known to absolutely everyone as Kenny, had his own history of heartbreak. He was the oldest of 4 children. John, Tony Ann, and Tommy followed him in birth order, a sequence that would define not just family dynamics, but how Kenny was perceived in his community. His brother Tommy later recalled with evident pride that growing up, "We weren't John, we weren't Tommy. We were always Kenny Pullman's little brother or little sister." That kind of reputation, where siblings are identified through association with an older brother, speaks to Kenny's charisma and presence within his social circles. Growing up on Long Island in what Tommy described as a different era, the Pullman children were raised when there were no phones or video games, when kids spent time playing in the neighborhood, and went home when the streetlights came on. Tommy's memories paint a picture of 1970s and 1980s suburban childhood. The Pullmans played sports from an early age, Whether it was stickball, football, or kickball, you name it, Tommy remembered, the entire neighborhood was always outside playing. This kind of upbringing, centered on physical activity and community interaction rather than digital isolation, shaped Kenny into someone who valued personal connection and face-to-face relationships. Kenny graduated from SUNY Old Westbury and built what everyone agreed was a successful career in the IT industry. For 18 years, he worked as a senior account executive at Converge Technology Group, a position that required both technical knowledge and interpersonal skills, selling technology solutions to businesses, maintaining client relationships, understanding both the product and the people. Tommy's assessment was simple and absolute. If you knew Kenny, you loved him. And if you didn't know him, I apologize. You didn't get to experience his love for life and his joy for life. But it was Kenny's role as a father that truly defined him, beyond his career or his social popularity. He had married young. His first wife was named Kim. Together, they welcomed 2 children, Brianna and Tyler, and built what all accounts describe as a happy family life. The couple was devoted to each other and their children, creating the kind of stable home environment that would make what happened next even more tragic. Then in 2007, when Kenny was just in his mid-30s, an age when most people are building careers and raising young children without contemplating mortality, tragedy struck. Kim was diagnosed with a rare form of cancer. Despite fighting bravely, despite medical interventions and the hope that accompanies every treatment, she lost her battle. Kenny was left to raise Brianna and Tyler as a single father, a role he had never anticipated playing. After Kim's death, Kenny threw himself into fatherhood with what those around him described as unwavering dedication. He created the Pullman Foundation to help raise money for cancer research in his wife's memory, transforming his grief into action that might help others. This kind of response, channeling personal tragedy into charitable work, reveals something about Kenny's character, his need to create meaning from loss. His dedication to his children became legendary within his social circles. Later, Kenny remarried and welcomed his youngest daughter, Jenna, into the world. The Pullman family traveled together to Disney, went on cruises, took vacations that created the kinds of memories children carry into adulthood. However, that second marriage eventually ended as well, leaving Kenny once again a single father, this time to 3 children spanning different ages and developmental stages. But around 2023, approximately a year and a half before his death, Kenny met Kelly Coppola. Both were single parents who had been through tremendous pain, Kenny through the death of his first wife and the dissolution of his second marriage, Kelly through an abusive relationship and contentious divorce. Both were ready to start over, to build something new. When they met, it was as if, according to those who witnessed their connection, 2 puzzle pieces had finally found their perfect fit. Kenny's father would later describe them as soulmates, a word often used casually, but that seemed in this case to capture something genuine. He brought the best out of her, Kenny's father explained, and she brought the best out of him. They had a second chance. "My son lost his wife 17 years ago," he added, emphasizing how long Kenny had waited to find this kind of happiness again. Kelly's family was equally moved by the transformation they witnessed in her. Laurie Patton said Kelly was in love for the first time in a long time, perhaps the first time she'd experienced healthy love rather than the distorted version that exists in abusive relationships. She embraced his family, and he embraced Gianna and the rest of her family, Laurie remembered. They were both really family-oriented people. The time she was with Kenny was the happiest of her life. "We've never seen her with someone that treated her so well." This last observation, that Kelly's family had never seen her treated so well, carries weight because it implies comparison, an implicit acknowledgement that previous relationships, specifically her marriage to Daniel, had fallen far short of how Kenny treated her. The couple moved in together at a beautiful home on Brasswood Road in St. James, a property valued at $1.1 million with 6 bedrooms, space enough for their blended family to spread out and grow. It was more than just a house, it was becoming the foundation for something larger than either of them individually. Kenny's 3 children, Brianna, 25, Tyler, 21, and Jenna, 14, welcomed Kelly and 15-year-old Gianna with open arms. Tommy wanted to make absolutely clear in his later statements to media that this wasn't some casual relationship, some fleeting romance between wounded people seeking temporary comfort. Kenny's been portrayed as the new boyfriend or the new beau, Tommy said, his frustration with that characterization evident. Kenny and his family welcomed Kelly and her family into their home. He was not the new beau. He was not the new boyfriend. This was two families coming together, creating something beautiful from the ashes of their previous tragedies. In June 2024, just 2 months before his death, Kenny threw Kelly the perfect 50th birthday party. For Kelly's family, seeing her so genuinely happy was everything they had hoped for after years of watching her struggle in her marriage to Daniel. While Kelly and Kenny didn't marry, a fact that some might see as significant but that those close to them insisted was irrelevant, their commitment to each other and their blended family was absolute. They were building a life together, making plans for the future, creating a home filled with what everyone described as love and laughter. Tommy said he wanted people to focus on the love that they had for one another when they died, the love that Kenny had for his family and friends, and the love that they all had for Kenny. Regardless of the circumstances, Tommy insisted, people deserve to be happy in life. Divorced, not divorced, I don't care what the circumstances are. They died in love with each other. If we can take a little piece out of all this, it's that they died loving one another. But there was one person who couldn't accept Kelly and Kenny's happiness. One person for whom their joy represented not inspiration, but an unbearable insult. Daniel Coppola watched his ex-wife's newfound contentment with growing resentment and rage. Once he learned about Kelly's relationship with Kenny, and in the age of social media and mutual acquaintances, such knowledge was inevitable, the threats began. Kenny's family would later say there had been numerous threats from Daniel, though the specific nature and frequency of these threats remain partly undocumented in public records. The Pullman family knew Daniel was bitterly jealous, watching from a distance as Kelly built the kind of relationship she'd never had with him. But they had no idea just how dangerous that jealousy would become. No concept that Daniel's rage was metastasizing from bitter resentment into active planning. What they didn't know, what Kelly and Kenny couldn't have known despite whatever precautions they might have considered, was that Daniel had been planning his revenge for months. The evidence that would later emerge would show premeditation so detailed, so methodical, that prosecutors would describe it as chilling. Daniel wasn't just angry. He was constructing a plan, refining it, preparing for the moment when he would take action. The 28th of August, 2024, was a typical Wednesday evening in St. James, an affluent Long Island hamlet where violent crime was rare enough to feel almost unimaginable. Kelly and Kenny were settling in for the night at their shared home on Brasswood Road. The house had become their sanctuary, a place where love had triumphed over past pain, where blended family dynamics were working despite the statistical challenges such arrangements face. 15-year-old Gianna was at home, likely preparing for another day at Smithtown High School East, where she was a cheerleader with the Long Island Cheer Diamonds, following in her mother's footsteps as someone involved in the competitive cheer world that had consumed so much of Kelly's attention over the years. It should have been just another peaceful evening in their new life together. The mundane rhythm of weeknight domesticity, homework, dinner cleanup, preparing for tomorrow. But 3 miles away on Harbor Road in Head of the Harbor, Daniel Coppola was preparing to put his plan into action. The proximity is worth noting. 3 miles is roughly a 5-minute drive, close enough that Daniel had easy access to his ex-wife's new life, close enough to watch, to monitor, to plan. Earlier that evening, Daniel had been driving with Gianna in the car. It was his scheduled custody time or visitation, a routine exchange that happens in divorced families across the country every day. But his behavior had been erratic and frightening. He was driving recklessly, hitting things, operating the vehicle in a manner that alarmed his teenage daughter. The 15-year-old became so scared that she asked her father to take her back to her mother's house, an unusual request that suggests Gianna sensed something seriously wrong with Daniel's mental state. Daniel agreed to return her, but once at the Brasswood Road home, he didn't simply drop Gianna off and leave as would be normal protocol. What happened next would turn Gianna from a child caught between divorced parents into an unwitting participant in her father's murder plot. At around 11:30 p.m., a time when most of the suburban neighborhood was winding down for the night, Daniel texted his 15-year-old daughter asking about Kenneth's bedroom location. Think about that question for a moment. A father texting his teenage daughter to inquire which bedroom her mother's boyfriend sleeps in. For Gianna, this question might have seemed odd, but not necessarily alarming. Divorced parents sometimes have strange requests, and teenagers often don't immediately recognize danger signals. Daniel then instructed Gianna to come outside and get into his vehicle. The teenager, unaware of what her father was planning, complied. She had no idea that she was about to become an unwitting participant in the most horrific night of her life, that her compliance with her father's request would haunt her with questions of whether she could have prevented what came next. With his daughter waiting in the car, a 15-year-old girl sitting in a vehicle just yards from the home where her mother was about to be murdered, Daniel positioned himself behind a bush near the front of the house. The choice of position suggests planning. He had thought about angles, about concealment, about how to approach the home without being seen from windows. He shot through the front door lock, a method that serves dual purposes, forcing entry while making a statement about power and violation. The sound of gunfire in a quiet suburban neighborhood at 11:30 at night would have been jarring, terrifying, a sound that doesn't belong in that landscape. He forced his way into the home, moving with what investigators would later determine was purposeful direction. He made his way upstairs to where Kelly and Kenny were, presumably in bed or preparing for bed, in the intimate vulnerability of nighttime in their own home. The attack was swift and brutal. Both Kelly and Kenny were shot to death. The exact sequence, who was shot first, whether there was any struggle, what words, if any, were exchanged, remains partly shielded from public knowledge, either because investigators withheld those details or because such specifics are too graphic for media consumption. What we know is that in his haste to escape after the shooting, Daniel left behind his sandals at the crime scene, a crucial piece of physical evidence that would tie him directly to the murders. As Daniel returned to his car, where his traumatized 15-year-old daughter was waiting, imagine being that child hearing gunshots, knowing your father went inside your mother's home, waiting in the dark. He made a confession that would haunt Gianna forever. He told his daughter directly, "I killed your mother and Kenny," and the 3-mile journey back to Daniel's home on Harbor Road must have been a nightmare for the teenager. She was sitting next to her father, who had just confessed to double murder, processing information no 15-year-old should have to process, grappling with the realization that her mother was dead and her father was the killer. As Daniel drove, Gianna began texting her friends in desperation. "I don't know what my father did," she wrote. "I don't know how my mother is." These messages, preserved as evidence, reveal a teenager trying to make sense of something incomprehensible, reaching out to peers because the adult in the car was the source of the horror. Gianna's friends tried to reach Kelly, but couldn't get through. Something was terribly wrong, and these teenagers knew it even if they didn't yet understand the full scope. At 11:45 p.m., Gianna called 911 from her father's home on Harbor Road, reporting that her father was threatening to kill himself with a gun. This call came approximately 15 minutes after the murders, time enough for Daniel to drive 3 miles, time enough for the reality to start settling in for both father and daughter. Officers from multiple jurisdictions responded immediately to the Harbor Road address based on Gianna's call. Meanwhile, at 11:54 p.m., 9 minutes after Gianna's call, Gianna's concerned friends made their own 911 call to report that the teenager had left her mother is home with her father without Kelly's permission. These friends, teenagers themselves, were thinking clearly enough to contact authorities when they couldn't reach Kelly, when Gianna's texts suggested something catastrophic had happened. When officers arrived at Daniel's home, they found him and took him into custody for the suicide threats, standard procedure when someone is reported as an imminent danger to themselves. Gianna directed them to a black semi-automatic handgun that Daniel had hidden in the house, evidence of the weapon used in the murders. At the same time, other officers responded to the Brasswood Road address based on the friend's 911 call reporting concern for Kelly and the suspicious circumstances of Gianna's departure. What they found there was a scene of unimaginable violence. The front door had been forced open, damage consistent with being shot. Inside, they discovered Kelly and Kenneth, both dead from gunshot wounds. The peaceful home where a blended family had been building a future together was now a crime scene. As the sun rose on Thursday, the 29th of August, the full horror of what had happened began to emerge, not just for the families involved, but for the wider community. Police began processing both crime scenes, Daniel's home on Harbour Road and the murder scene on Brasswood Road. What investigators discovered during the search of Daniel's home was shocking even to seasoned detectives accustomed to homicide investigations. They found typewritten documents detailing his murder plot in what prosecutors would later describe as excruciating detail. The planning documents stated, "I am of sound mind, and I know exactly what I'm going to do." This declaration is legally significant because it preempts any potential insanity defense. Daniel was documenting his own mental competence, his awareness of his actions, his intentionality. But the discovery that perhaps best illustrates the depth of Daniel's rage was this. He had prepared individual bullets, marked with the names of everyone involved in his divorce case. Not just Kelly and Kenny, but both parties' divorce attorneys, the lawyers who had represented him and Kelly during their contentious separation. Assistant District Attorney Eric Abulafia would later reveal in court proceedings that Daniel had even had a bullet with his own attorney's name on it, suggesting that Daniel blamed even the legal professional hired to represent his interests. The evidence showed that Daniel blamed Kelly entirely for what he perceived as his financial ruin. His rage extended to everyone he held responsible for his perceived misfortune. A worldview where the divorce had destroyed him and everyone involved in that process deserved punishment. He had contemplated a much larger massacre, investigators determined, one that would have targeted everyone connected to his divorce had he followed through with his complete plan. The labeled bullets represented intended victims beyond Kelly and Kenny. At the crime scene on Brasswood Road, investigators found Daniel's sandals, one of them discovered underneath Kenneth's body. This physical evidence was significant not just for placing Daniel at the scene, but for what it suggested about the final moments. Kenny's brother Tommy would later say with certainty, "My brother died trying to protect Kelly." Even in death, Kenny had been trying to save the woman he loved, his body positioned in a way that suggested he had moved between Kelly and the shooter, or struggled with Daniel, or attempted some intervention that cost him his life. Body camera footage captured Daniel's immediate confession to the murders when officers first took him into custody. In the age of police body cameras, such evidence is invaluable. It captures demeanor, words, behavior in the immediate aftermath before suspects have time to consult attorneys or construct defensive narratives. Suffolk County District Attorney Raymond Tierney called the murders a premeditated ambush and execution, language chosen carefully for its legal implications. Ambush suggests planning, waiting, attacking from concealment. Execution suggests intentional killing rather than crime of passion, loss of control. On the 29th of August 2024, Daniel was charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder. These initial charges reflected the immediate evidence available: 2 people dead, Daniel's confession, his presence at the scene. During his arraignment on the 30th of August, just 2 days after the murders, Daniel pleaded not guilty and was remanded without bail. The courtroom was filled with family members and friends of the victims, emotions running high, with outbursts from the gallery as one person called Daniel a murderer directly. Kelly's father, John Patton, described the sorrow the family was feeling as overwhelming, a word that barely captures watching your daughter be murdered by her ex-husband, knowing your granddaughter witnessed the aftermath. As prosecutors reviewed the extensive evidence of premeditation, the planning documents, the labeled bullets, the typewritten statements, the charges were upgraded on the 6th of September to 4 counts of first-degree murder. This upgrade is significant in New York law. First-degree murder charges are reserved for specific circumstances, including murder for hire, serial killing, or killing in furtherance of another felony. The 4 counts likely reflect different legal theories, under which Daniel's actions qualified as first-degree murder under New York statutes. If convicted on these upgraded charges, Daniel would face life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, New York having abolished the death penalty in 2007. The legal proceedings took a dramatic turn when Daniel suffered what was described as a self-inflicted spinal cord injury whilst on suicide watch at Suffolk County Jail. The exact nature of how he inflicted this injury wasn't publicly detailed, but it was severe enough to require surgery and resulted in Daniel appearing at subsequent court proceedings from his hospital bed. His defense attorney, Stephen Pitty, said Daniel suffered an injury while in the jail, adding that the extent of that injury they were trying to determine with the doctors. Pitty also noted that he didn't think anyone who has ever been charged with murder is in a positive mental state, a statement that attempts to contextualize Daniel's behavior without necessarily excusing it. The murders sent shockwaves through the Long Island community, a region where such violence between divorced spouses was rare enough to dominate local news coverage for weeks. The response was immediate and overwhelming, reflecting both sympathy for the victims' families and horror at the circumstances. A GoFundMe campaign called Kenny's Kids was set up by his employer, Converged Technology Group, to support Kenny's 3 children, Brianna, Tyler, and Jenna, who had lost their father in a senseless act of violence. The fund raised over $148,000, approaching its goal of $150,000. That this campaign was organized by Kenny's workplace speaks to the impact he'd had professionally, the relationships he'd built during his 18 years with the company. A separate fund called Support Gianna After Tragic Loss was created by Kelly's family to help the traumatized teenager who had lost her mother and witnessed her father's confession. The fund raised over $96,000 in just 5 days, with more than 1,000 donations flooding in from people touched by the tragedy. The speed and scale of these donations reflect public horror at what Gianna had endured, being used as an unwitting accomplice, hearing her father's confession, losing her mother, all while being just 15 years old. Kenny's memorial service was held at St. Elizabeth of Hungary Church in Melville on the 3rd of September, with hundreds attending to pay respects. Family members described Kenny as a friend to all whose smile and positive attitude were contagious, emphasizing the life he'd lived rather than the violence of his death. Kelly's services were held at Molony's Hopos Funeral Home on the 4th and 5th of September, where she was remembered for her vibrant personality and contagious smile, descriptions that echoed what her family had always said about her, that she was someone who spread joy wherever she went. Tommy Pullman was determined that his brother's legacy wouldn't be overshadowed by the violence that took his life. Tommy said, "We are not going to let a heinous murderer overshadow the life and legacy of my brother. Number one, we have his kids. His kids will be taken care of." This promise, that Kenny's children would be supported, was important not just practically but symbolically, a way of ensuring that Daniel's violence wouldn't destroy the next generation. Tommy added what he would want to say to Kenny if given one more chance. "I would tell him I love him one more time. All of my siblings would tell him that it was an honor and a privilege to be known as Kenny Pullman's little brother. We will always be Kenny Pullman's little brother." This statement circles back to Tommy's earlier memory about how all the Pullman siblings were identified through their relationship to Kenny, suggesting that even in death, Kenny's presence would continue defining how they saw themselves. For Gianna, the trauma of that night, of being used as an unwitting participant in her father's plan, of hearing his confession, of losing her mother so violently, is unimaginable in its scope. The 15-year-old cheerleader now lives with family members, supported by her extended family and community, as she tries to process the horror of losing her mother in such a violent way while her father sits in jail awaiting trial for the murder. The psychological impact on a child who experiences what Gianna experienced cannot be overstated. Research on children who witness or are connected to parental violence shows elevated rates of PTSD, depression, anxiety, and complex trauma that can affect development for years. Gianna will carry questions for the rest of her life. Could she have known what her father intended? Should she have refused to get in the car? Could she have warned her mother? These are questions with no good answers, questions that trauma therapists will help her work through, but that will likely never be fully resolved. The case also highlights broader issues about post-separation violence in domestic abuse situations. Research consistently shows that the period after a victim leaves an abuser is the most dangerous time, when the abuser's control is threatened and violence can escalate. Kelly had done everything survivors are told to do. She left, she divorced, she moved on with her life. But Daniel's rage didn't dissipate with time. It intensified. The fact that Daniel had allegedly made threats to Kenny's family before the murders raises questions about whether there were missed opportunities for intervention. Were these threats reported to police? Were there restraining orders in place? Could the family court system have done more to protect Kelly and Kenny? These questions remain partly unanswered in public records, but they're crucial for understanding how such tragedies might be prevented in the future. The labeled bullets Daniel prepared represent a level of premeditation that goes beyond typical crimes of passion. This wasn't a man who snapped in a moment of rage. This was someone who sat down, prepared ammunition, labeled each bullet with a name, typed out planning documents. The psychological profile that emerges is of someone who felt justified in his actions, who saw himself as a victim seeking righteous vengeance rather than a perpetrator committing murder. The legal proceedings moving forward will likely explore Daniel's mental state, not to excuse his actions but to understand them. Did he meet the legal threshold for insanity, or was he, as his own documents claimed, of sound mind and fully aware of what he was doing? How will the prosecution present the premeditation evidence? How will the defense attempt to create doubt or seek a lesser charge? As of the last available information, Daniel Coppola remains in custody awaiting trial on 4 counts of first-degree murder. The case continues to work its way through the New York legal system, with the possibility of life imprisonment without parole hanging over Daniel if convicted. For the families of Kelly Coppola and Kenneth Pullman, no legal outcome will bring their loved ones back or undo the trauma inflicted on Gianna and Kenny's children. In the end, what remains most powerful about this chilling true story isn't the violence, though the violence was undeniably horrific, but rather the love that Kelly and Kenny had found after years of hardship. That love, imperfect and interrupted as it was, remains the most meaningful part of their story. They had created something beautiful, a blended family where children from different backgrounds were welcomed, where past pain was being transformed into future hope, where two people who had both suffered found comfort in each other. That Daniel's rage destroyed this emerging family makes the tragedy even more profound. Kelly and Kenny deserved the happiness they had found. Their children deserved to grow up in the loving environment they were creating. Gianna deserved a mother who would watch her graduate, who would be there for future milestones. As Tommy Pullman noted, we had Kenny in our lives for 53 years, 7 months, 17 days, 14 hours, and 29 minutes. That precise accounting, down to the minute, represents a family trying to hold on to every moment, refusing to let their loved one be reduced to just another crime statistic. For Kelly's family, similar grief and similar determination to remember her as she was, not just as a victim. This real crime documentary serves as both a warning about the dangers of post-separation violence and a memorial to two people who found love when they most needed it. The investigative documentary aspects, the evidence, the timeline, the legal proceedings, matter because they ensure justice. But the human story, the criminal psychology of jealousy transformed into lethal violence, the dark history of domestic abuse, the chilling true story of how rage can fester into premeditated murder, these elements matter because they might help prevent future tragedies. If Kelly's death can prompt better protections for domestic violence survivors after separation, if Gianna's trauma can inspire better support systems for children caught in high-conflict divorces, if Kenny's murder can encourage communities to take threats from bitter ex-spouses more seriously, then perhaps some meaning can be salvaged from this senseless crime investigation. The unsolved question that remains, the one that haunts true crime followers and investigative documentaries, isn't who committed the crime. Daniel Coppola's guilt is not in doubt. He confessed immediately. The unsolved question is why systems designed to protect people like Kelly failed, and what must change so that others in similar situations have a better chance at survival. Kelly and Kenny died in love with each other, as Tommy insisted. That love is what we should remember, even as we examine the criminal psychology that destroyed it.